The helicopter is sitting on the pad, and the rotor blades are drooping. Not dramatically, not collapsed, not damaged. Just drooping, gently, under their own weight, the way long, thin things droop when they are not being asked to do anything. The blades of a helicopter at rest hang slightly below the horizontal, following gravity, the tips lower than the hub. The whole rotor system relaxed into its natural resting geometry. When the engine starts and the rotor begins to spin, centrifugal force will lift those blades to their working position, flat and taut and precisely positioned, each one a spinning wing generating the lift that will carry the aircraft into the air. But right now, the engine is off and the machine is still, and the blades droop in the last of the evening light. If this kind of story is how you end your nights, so please subscribe right now so you never miss one. Hit the like button, it means everything to this channel. And drop a comment telling us where in the world you are watching from and what time it is there. We love knowing who is out there with us. Now, let's go flying. The helicopter is one of the most remarkable machines human beings have ever built. And it is remarkable in a very specific way. It is a machine built to solve a problem that no other flying machine can solve, which is how to go anywhere, land anywhere, hold completely still in the air anywhere, and do all of this regardless of whether there is a runway, a road, a clearing, or any other prepared surface within range. A fixed-wing aircraft needs speed. It needs forward motion to generate the lift that keeps it flying, which means it needs a runway to build that speed on departure, and a runway, or at least a long clear surface to dissipate it on landing. Everything about a fixed-wing aircraft is organized around the fact of its forward motion, its range, its efficiency, its performance envelope. It is a magnificent machine, but it is a machine that needs room. The helicopter needs nothing of the kind. The helicopter can take off from a rooftop, from a ship's deck, from a clearing in a forest, from a ledge on a mountain face, from the deck of a burning oil platform, from a beach at low tide, from the median strip of a motorway in an emergency. It can hover motionless over any of these surfaces at any altitude. It can fly sideways, fly backwards, rotate in place. It is the only heavier-than-air aircraft that can do any of these things. And it can do all of them simultaneously if the situation calls for it. None of this comes cheaply. The helicopter is mechanically complex, physically demanding to fly, and acoustically conspicuous in a way that its aerodynamic sophistication alone cannot fully account for. It is more expensive per hour of operation than a comparable fixed-wing aircraft, more sensitive to weather, more constrained by its power requirements at high altitude and high temperature. But it can go where nothing else can go. It can stop where nothing else can stop. And on a helipad at dusk, with the rotor blades hanging at rest, and the last of the day's warmth still in the machine's metal, it is one of the most purposeful objects in the world. The evening light moves across the rotor disc. Tomorrow, the blades will spin. Tonight, they rest. A helicopter rotor blade is a wing, not metaphorically, literally, aerodynamically, in every meaningful physical sense. The cross-section of a rotor blade is an aerofoil, curved on the upper surface, flatter on the lower surface, shaped so that air moving over the top travels a longer path than air moving underneath. Longer path, in the same time, means faster speed. Faster speed means lower pressure, by Bernoulli's principle. Lower pressure on the upper surface, relative to higher pressure on the lower surface, produces a net upward force. Lift. The difference between a rotor blade and the wing of a fixed-wing aircraft is not in how lift is generated, the physics are identical, but in how the blade meets the air. A fixed wing on an aircraft meets the air because the aircraft is moving forward, the forward speed creating the relative wind that flows over the wing. A rotor blade meets the air because it is spinning, the rotational speed creating its own relative wind regardless of whether the aircraft is moving at all. The helicopter does not need to be going anywhere to generate lift. It generates lift the moment the rotor is spinning at the correct speed, whether the aircraft is stationary on the pad, hovering motionless in the air, or flying at cruise speed. This is the aerodynamic root of the helicopter's freedom. The rotor speed, the RPM at which the rotor turns, is held constant in flight. For most helicopters, the rotor turns at a specific RPM that is maintained by the engine's governor, regardless of the power demand or the flight condition. And what changes is not how fast the blades spin, but how they are angled to the air. The pitch angle of each blade, the angle at which its leading edge meets the relative wind. Increasing the pitch angle increases the angle of attack, the angle at which the blade is presenting its aerofoil cross-section to the airflow. A higher angle of attack generates more lift, but also more drag. More drag requires more engine power to maintain the same rotor speed. The collective pitch control, the lever on the pilot's left side, analogous to a throttle in its effect, changes the pitch of all blades simultaneously and equally. Pull the collective up, and every blade pitches more steeply. Every blade generates more lift. The rotor produces more total upward force, and the helicopter rises. Push the collective down, and every blade pitches flatter. So every blade generates less lift. The total upward force decreases, and the helicopter descends. The balance point, the collective position at which the rotor produces exactly enough lift to support the helicopter's weight, is the hover. In a hover, the helicopter is neither rising nor descending. The rotor is generating upward force exactly equal to the downward force of gravity on the aircraft and everything aboard it. The engine is working hard to maintain the rotor RPM against the drag of the pitched blades. The pilot's hand on the collective is making continuous small adjustments, responding to the micro variations in the balance as turbulence, temperature changes, and the aircraft's own movement disturb it. Hovering is not a state of rest. It is a state of continuous, active balancing. The machine kept still by constant effort. But from outside, from the ground below, the helicopter appears motionless, suspended, as if gravity has been suspended for this particular object in this particular moment, which, from a certain angle, is exactly what is happening. The blades spin, the air is pressed downward, the helicopter rises, and then, if the pilot holds the collective precisely where it needs to be, it simply stays, right there, in the air, without moving. Newton's third law does not care that you are trying to build a helicopter. Every action produces an equal and opposite reaction. The engine turns the main rotor clockwise, using the fuselage as its point of reaction. So, the fuselage wants to turn counterclockwise. Not gently, not as a minor inconvenience, with a force proportional to the torque being applied to the rotor, which in a powerful helicopter is substantial. Without any correction, a helicopter with a single main rotor would simply spin the wrong way. The fuselage rotating in the direction opposite to the rotor until something stopped it. This problem was understood as soon as people began seriously attempting to build helicopters. The first proposed solutions involved using two main rotors, either coaxial rotors mounted one above the other on the same shaft, spinning in opposite directions so their torque effects cancelled, or side-by-side rotors positioned at each end of the fuselage. Both approaches work, and both are still in use in specific applications today. But they are mechanically complex, and the engineers who worked on early helicopter design understood that a simpler solution would be preferable if one could be found. Igor Sikorsky found it. His solution, incorporated in the VS-300 of 1939, was the tail rotor, a small rotor mounted on a shaft running along the tail boom and oriented vertically so that it pushed air sideways rather than downward. The sideways thrust of the tail rotor, acting at the end of the tail boom and therefore at a significant distance from the aircraft's center of gravity, generates a moment that directly opposes the torque tendency of the main rotor. Adjust the pitch of the tail rotor blades to produce more or less sideways thrust, and you control the balance between the tail rotor's corrective moment and the main rotor's torque-induced tendency to rotate the fuselage. The pilot controls the tail rotor through the anti-torque pedals. Two pedals under the instrument panel, operated by the feet, and exactly like the rudder pedals in a fixed-wing aircraft, but with a completely different function. Pressing the left pedal increases the tail rotor's pitch and sideways thrust, pushing the tail right and yawing the nose left. Pressing the right pedal reduces the tail rotor's thrust, allowing the main rotor torque to push the nose right. In a helicopter with a single main rotor turning counterclockwise as viewed from above, the standard in most American-designed helicopters, increasing power requires more left pedal to maintain the heading, because more power to the main rotor produces more torque that the tail rotor must counteract. In a hover, managing the tail rotor is a continuous task alongside managing the collective and the cyclic. A helicopter pilot's feet are never still. The subtle variations in power demand, such as the effects of wind on the tail, the small moments generated by the shifting weight distribution of everything aboard, all of these create yaw tendencies that the pedals must constantly correct. Sikorsky's single main rotor, single tail rotor configuration has proven to be the dominant solution to the torque problem for over 80 years. The vast majority of helicopters in the world today use it. It is mechanically simpler than the two main rotor alternatives, gives a longer fuselage that improves certain handling qualities, and provides yaw control that is effective and intuitive. A small rotor at the end of a boom, pushing sideways, quietly solving every second of every flight the physical problem that would otherwise spin the machine apart. A helicopter pilot controls the aircraft with both hands and both feet simultaneously, not in alternation, simultaneously. The left hand holds the collective, the lever that controls altitude, by changing the pitch of all rotor blades at once. The right hand holds the cyclic, the stick that controls direction by tilting the rotor disc. The feet manage the anti-torque pedals that control the heading. All three inputs are active at all times in any demanding phase of flight, each one affecting the others, none of them truly independent. The collective is the most intuitive of the three controls in description, if not in practice. Raise it, and every rotor blade pitches to a higher angle of attack simultaneously. More lift, helicopter rises. Lower it, and every blade pitches flatter. Less lift, helicopter descends. The Collective has a motorcycle-style throttle twist grip on its end on many piston-engine helicopters, so that the pilot can increase power as they raise the Collective. More lift demands more power, and the correlation is built into the controls design. On turbine-powered helicopters, an engine governor manages this correlation automatically, keeping the rotor RPM constant, regardless of the Collective position. The cyclic is less intuitively described because its effect involves an aerodynamic mechanism that is not immediately obvious. When the pilot pushes the cyclic forward, the helicopter does not simply tilt forward and fly. The mechanism involves changing the pitch of each rotor blade individually as it rotates around the disc. The blade heading toward the rear of the aircraft has its pitch increased, generating more lift on the rear of the disc. The blade heading toward the front has its pitch decreased, generating less lift at the front. The result is that the rear of the disc rises and the front falls. The disc tilts forward, and the lift force, which acts perpendicular to the disc, is now directed slightly forward as well as upward. That forward component of the lift force accelerates the helicopter forward. Push the cyclic right, and the same mechanism tilts the disc to the right, and the helicopter moves right. Pull it back, and the disc tilts aft, and the helicopter decelerates or flies backwards. Push it left, and the helicopter moves left. The cyclic gives the helicopter its lateral and longitudinal mobility, its ability to move in any horizontal direction from a hover, or to control the flight path in forward flight. The combination of collective and cyclic gives the helicopter access to the full three-dimensional space above the terrain in a way that no other aircraft matches. The fixed-wing aircraft can climb and descend and bank and turn, but it cannot hover, cannot fly sideways, cannot back up. The helicopter can do all of these things, and it can transition between them instantly, limited only by the pilot's ability to manage three independent control inputs simultaneously while tracking the aircraft's position, the weather, the terrain, and the task. Learning to hover is considered one of the most challenging initial skills in helicopter pilot training. The body must learn to make hundreds of simultaneous corrections per minute across three axes of control, each correction small enough not to overcorrect and create the opposite problem. And the training manuals describe it as rubbing your stomach while patting your head while counting backwards from 100. In practice, what happens is that the body learns. The corrections become automatic. The hover becomes still. And then, one day, without being able to identify exactly when it happened, the pilot finds themselves hovering perfectly, both hands working, both feet working, the aircraft motionless, all of it happening below the level of conscious thought. The hover is not a natural state, not for the machine, not for the air. Nature does not produce many things that remain stationary in midair. The kestrel hovers, facing into the wind, its head held perfectly still as its body absorbs the turbulence. And it does so by the same aerodynamic means the helicopter uses, generating upward lift through a surface moving through the air. But even the kestrel uses the wind to help, facing into it to reduce the airspeed differential it must maintain. The helicopter in a still air hover has no such assistance. The rotor disc must generate all of the upward force from its own rotation alone, the engine burning more fuel per unit of time in the hover than in almost any other phase of flight. What the hovering rotor creates around itself is a toroid of moving air, a ring of downward flowing air that descends from the rotor, spreads outward at the ground, rises at the periphery, and curves inward to re-enter the rotor disc from above. This recirculation of air around the rotor is called the vortex ring condition, and it is normally mild and manageable in a stable hover. The rotor is continuously ingesting the air it has already disturbed, which is slightly less efficient than ingesting undisturbed air. But the condition is stable. The danger arises during descent, particularly a steep, slow descent, when the helicopter is sinking into its own rotor downwash. In this condition, the rotor is descending into the vortex ring it has been creating below itself, encountering its own disturbed air as its primary inflow. The lift produced by a rotor ingesting its own disturbed downwash is significantly less than normal, and the helicopter begins a rapid, uncommanded descent that, increasing the collective, will not reliably stop, because raising the collective in this condition can deepen the vortex ring state by increasing the downwash the rotor is descending into. This is called vortex ring state, or power settling, and the recovery requires the pilot to move the helicopter out of the descending column of disturbed air, typically by pushing the cyclic forward to gain forward airspeed, which changes the inflow geometry and allows the rotor to encounter clean air again. Every helicopter pilot learns about vortex ring state in training because it is a condition that can develop quickly at low altitude in what seems like a normal approach, and the correct response, forward cyclic in a descent close to the ground, is counterintuitive enough that it requires practiced knowledge rather than reflexive response. Outside of the vortex ring condition, the hover demonstrates what the helicopter does better than anything else alive or built: hold a precise position in three-dimensional space, with no reference surface and no forward speed. The rescue helicopter, hovering over a stricken vessel at night in rough seas, its winchman descending on the cable below, maintains its position against wind and turbulence by constant autopilot input, or by the pilot's own control corrections. Both are essentially the same process at different levels of human versus automated response. The police helicopter holds its hover over a suspect in a field, its camera fixed on the target below, on the aircraft drifting only millimeters as the pilot works the controls in the dark. The news helicopter holds its position over a traffic incident, the lens zoomed to reveal details no ground observer can see, the aircraft immovable in the airspace above the scene, each of them motionless, each of them doing the thing that everything about their design was built to make possible, staying exactly here, in the middle of the air. On September 14th, 1939, in a field in Stratford, Connecticut, a man in a suit and a fedora climbed into a strange-looking tubular frame, started an engine, and rose approximately 3 feet off the ground for approximately 10 seconds. He was tethered. The machine was experimental, while the 10 seconds of flight were the end point of months of construction on a $30,000 budget that had been granted to save a company that was about to be shut down for lack of business. When the company's president had called Igor Sikorsky in to tell him that Sikorsky Aircraft was being closed, Sikorsky had responded with a proposal to build a helicopter. The proposal was granted. The budget was set. Sikorsky committed to having a prototype ready in 5 months. The machine he produced, the VS-300, was the first helicopter with a single main rotor and a single tail rotor. It was powered by a 75 horsepower 4-cylinder engine. The main rotor was 28 feet in diameter, and the fuselage was an open steel tube framework with no enclosed cabin. The pilot sat fully exposed to the air in a seat bolted to the structure, with no windscreen, no instruments beyond the absolute minimum, and no protection if anything went wrong. 10 seconds, 3 feet, tethered. It was enough. It was enough to demonstrate that the design worked, that the torque was controlled, that the controls were responsive. Sikorsky knew what he had on September 14th, 1939. He would spend the next several years refining it. The VS-300 went through 19 different configurations before reaching its final form. But the fundamental architecture of the machine that flew for 10 seconds on that autumn afternoon in Connecticut is the architecture of almost every helicopter flying today. Single main rotor, single tail rotor, and collective pitch on the main blades for altitude control, cyclic control for directional flight. The VS-300 established a world endurance record on May 6, 1941, staying aloft for 1 hour and 32 minutes. By that point, Sikorsky had already received a contract from the United States Army for a production helicopter. The resulting aircraft, the R-4, entered production in 1942, the first mass-produced helicopter in history. The R-4 was the only helicopter to see service in World War II, used primarily for search and rescue in the Burma campaign and in Alaska. Sikorsky was most proud of his helicopter for its life-saving potential. When asked about the most important use of the machine he had spent his life building, he spoke not of military applications or commercial possibilities, but of rescue, of reaching people in places where no other vehicle could reach them, of the particular capability of a hovering aircraft to hold its position over a person in distress and lower a line to them. When Sikorsky died in 1972, helicopters had performed thousands of rescues on every continent. The Coast Guards and mountain rescue services and naval air squadrons that fly the current generation of his machine's descendants perform more of these rescues every year. The man in the suit and the fedora, the tubular frame, the 10 seconds, everything that came from it. The rotor blade is moving faster than you can perceive. Standing beside a helicopter as it spins up, the individual blades blur before the rotor has reached half its operating speed. By the time the engine has brought the rotor to its governed RPM, somewhere between 200 and 500 revolutions per minute, depending on the helicopter, the larger aircraft turning more slowly, the individual blades are completely invisible. The disc appears as a transparent circle above the fuselage, the tips leaving faint trails in the air if you know what to look for, and the angle of light cooperates. What is happening at those blade tips is remarkable. The tip speed of a main rotor blade is typically around 215 meters per second, approximately 700 feet per second. To put this in context, the speed of sound at sea level is approximately 340 meters per second. A helicopter rotor blade tip is moving at approximately 60% of the speed of sound. It is, among all the objects in the vicinity of a hovering helicopter, by far the fastest moving thing. This tip speed is not the speed of the helicopter. The helicopter might be stationary in a hover. It is the speed of the blade's rotational motion, the tangential velocity at the outermost point of the rotating disc. The blade at the hub is moving much more slowly. The velocity increases continuously from the root to the tip, proportional to the distance from the center of rotation. At the tip, the aerodynamic loading is highest, the blade is moving fastest, and the structural and aerodynamic demands on the blade material are at their peak. The blades must be built to tolerate these demands continuously through tens of thousands of hours of operating life. Modern rotor blades are composite structures, carbon fiber and glass fiber laminates over a structural core. The fiber orientations chosen to optimize stiffness in the directions the blade loads demand while minimizing weight everywhere else. The blade must be stiff enough not to flutter. The aeroelastic instability that would destroy it if the blade's structural natural frequencies were poorly matched to the aerodynamic forcing frequencies, but flexible enough to absorb the loads of flight without fatigue cracking at the root. The blade pitch is continuously varying as the blade rotates. The cyclic pitch control changes the angle of attack of each blade as a function of its position around the disc, so that the blade pitches to a different angle at each azimuth position. This means the blade is not simply rotating at a fixed pitch. It is twisting slightly back and forth once per revolution. The mechanical input from the swash plate at the rotor head translating into the blade pitch change that produces directional flight. The swash plate, the mechanical device that converts the pilot's cyclic and collective control inputs into individual blade pitch changes as a function of azimuth position, is one of the most elegant pieces of mechanical engineering in aviation. A non-rotating plate that connects to a rotating plate through a bearing, transmitting both collective and cyclic pitch inputs to the blades without itself rotating. The blade spins. The tip passes through the air at 700 feet per second. The pitch changes once per revolution. The disc tilts, the helicopter moves. All of it happening at a speed the eye cannot follow. So all of it happening continuously. From the moment the engine spins the rotor to the moment the engine stops and the blades droop back down to rest. If the engine stops, the first thing the pilot does is push the collective all the way down. Not as a panic response, as the trained, immediate, correct response to an engine failure that every helicopter pilot practices repeatedly before they are allowed to fly with passengers. The collective goes down within the first second of recognizing the engine failure, because the rotor RPM is already beginning to decay, and every second of delay means more RPM lost, and RPM is the energy reserve the aircraft will need to land safely. When the collective goes down, the blade pitch decreases to nearly flat, and the drag on the blades, the aerodynamic drag that the engine was working against to maintain the rotor speed, drops dramatically. The rotor, freed from much of its braking drag, is now free to respond to the airflow through it. And as the helicopter begins to descend, losing altitude without engine power, that descent creates an upward flow of air through the rotor disc, just as descending into wind would create upward flow through any surface. This upward airflow pushes on the underside of the rotor blades and keeps them spinning. The helicopter is descending on its own stored aerodynamic energy, like a sycamore seed rotating as it falls, the spinning a consequence of the descent, and the descent in turn sustaining the spinning. This is autorotation, not the state in which the main rotor turns not from engine power, but from the aerodynamic forces of the aircraft's descent. In autorotation, the rotor RPM can be maintained close to its normal operating value for the duration of the descent. The pilot has control of the aircraft through the cyclic and the pedals. The tail rotor is driven by the same transmission as the main rotor and continues to function normally. The collective can be used to adjust the rotor RPM within its safe range by changing the blade pitch and thus the drag. The descent rate in autorotation is high, typically somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 feet per minute, depending on the helicopter and the conditions. But it is controlled descent, not freefall. The aircraft is gliding, converting altitude into the rotor energy that will be used for landing, and the landing itself uses that stored energy. At 50 to 100 feet above the ground, the pilot flares, pulling back on the cyclic to tilt the rotor disc aft, increasing the angle of attack of all blades and converting the rotor's rotational energy into lift, slowing the descent rate and simultaneously bleeding off forward speed. The rotor RPM increases during the flare as the changed geometry produces more driving force from the air. Then, as the aircraft slows and settles toward the surface, the pilot raises the collective, taking the last of the stored rotor energy as a burst of lift to cushion the touchdown. The entire sequence, engine failure, immediate collective reduction, glide, flare, collective pull, touchdown, takes perhaps 30 to 60 seconds from failure to ground, and requires a landing zone of roughly the same dimensions as the helicopter's rotor disc. Every helicopter pilot practices it regularly, not because engine failures are common, but because the skill decays without practice, and the window for the correct initial response is measured in seconds. In 1972, the French pilot Jean Boulet set the altitude record for a helicopter, reaching 40,814 feet in an aerospatiale llama. At that altitude, the outside air temperature was minus 63 degrees Celsius. When he reduced power to begin the descent, his engine flamed out and could not be restarted in the extreme cold. He descended 12,000 meters in auto-rotation and landed safely, the engine off, the rotor spinning, the altitude becoming energy, the energy becoming a landing, the pilot alive. At 50 feet above the ground, the world reveals itself, not the world of maps and satellite images, and the abstracted top-down view of altitude, the world of texture and detail, and the particular intimacy of being very close to the surface while still being completely free of it. At 50 feet in a helicopter, you are below the canopy of a mature forest and above the undergrowth, moving through the space between. You are at the height of a 4-story building, but there is no building around you, only air and the ground passing below at whatever speed the aircraft is flying. You can read the surface of the terrain, the drainage channels that don't appear on maps, the animal tracks through the grass, the boundary between soil types visible as a line of different vegetation. This is the world the helicopter inhabits that no other aircraft does. A fixed-wing aircraft must maintain enough altitude to ensure safe clearance above terrain and obstacles, because their minimum speed is much higher than the helicopters, and their turning radius at any useful speed is large. A fixed-wing aircraft flying at 100 knots takes several hundred meters to turn 90 degrees. It cannot follow the contour of a mountain face, cannot thread between ridgelines, cannot drop into a valley and come back up without committing to a minimum radius of maneuver that the terrain may not allow. The helicopter can do all of these things because its minimum speed is 0. It can stop, it can back away from an obstacle it has approached too closely. It can hold its position and assess a landing zone before committing to land. The perspective from a low-flying helicopter is specific and unrepeatable. Looking forward from the cockpit at 50 feet and 100 knots, the terrain rushes toward you and passes below simultaneously. The ground is both very close and very far, the perspective compressing the distance ahead and expanding the detail below. Trees appear first as tops and then as trunks as the aircraft passes over them. Rivers appear as lines of reflected light that widen into actual water features only seconds before the aircraft crosses them. Animal herds are individual animals that scatter as the aircraft approaches. At sea level, skimming the ocean surface at low altitude, the wave pattern is visible in full detail. The individual crests and troughs, the direction and size of the swell, the spray torn from the wave tops by the wind. The maritime patrol helicopter, working at low altitude over the surface in poor weather, is operating in an environment inaccessible to any other flying machine in those conditions. The medical helicopter, flying to the scene of a road accident in a rural area, lands in a field that was a field a minute ago and is now a landing zone, the only criteria being a clear area roughly the size of the aircraft's rotor diameter and a surface firm enough for the wheels. No infrastructure required, no approach path to fly. The aircraft arrives, touches down, the crew gets out, the work begins. The mountain search and rescue helicopter operates at altitudes where the air is thin and the terrain is unforgiving, landing on ledges that the crew has assessed from the air, confirmed as sufficient and committed to using. The rotor disc clearing the rock face by meters. The film helicopter flying alongside a racing car at exactly matching speed for a tracking shot. The camera operator in the rear door, the aircraft 50 feet to the side and 30 feet above. A maneuver that requires the pilot to hold a precise three-dimensional position relative to a moving target while managing the aircraft's own aerodynamics in the wake turbulence of another fast-moving object. All of these things are the helicopter's world, the world at 50 feet, intimate, precise, completely free. In 1951, Charles Carman modified a helicopter with a new kind of engine, and the helicopter became practical. Before this, most helicopters used piston engines, the same reciprocating internal combustion engines that powered early aircraft and automobiles. Piston engines are heavy for their power output, require complex cooling systems, and their power decreases significantly at altitude and in high temperature conditions, precisely the conditions in which helicopters are most often needed. A piston helicopter working at high altitude in summer is operating with a fraction of its sea-level engine power available to it, which is a serious limitation for a machine whose primary advantage is its ability to go exactly where it is needed, regardless of terrain. The turboshaft engine solved this problem. A turboshaft is a variant of the jet engine family, sharing its fundamental operating principle. Air is compressed, fuel is burned in the compressed air, and the expanding combustion gases drive a turbine, but configured to extract all of the turbine's useful work as shaft power, rather than as jet thrust. The shaft turns the helicopter's rotor transmission, so that the exhaust gases leave through the back of the engine, providing a small amount of residual thrust, but no meaningful propulsion. The engine's job is to turn the shaft, not to generate a jet. The power-to-weight ratio of a turboshaft engine is dramatically better, than a piston engine of comparable power. A modern helicopter turboshaft, producing 1,000 shaft horsepower, may weigh less than 200 kilograms, roughly the weight of an adult horse, producing the equivalent power of approximately 10 adult horses. The piston engine that would produce the same power would be significantly heavier. For a machine whose performance is directly limited by the ratio of power available to weight to be lifted, this matters enormously, and the turboshaft also maintains its power more consistently across the altitude and temperature range in which helicopters operate. Above a certain inlet temperature, the power of a turboshaft does decrease, the hot and high performance limitation that helicopter operators take seriously in mountainous desert environments. But the decrease is more gradual and more predictable than in piston engines, and the turboshaft starts reliably in very cold conditions where the piston engine might not. The turboshaft engine made helicopters fast enough, powerful enough, and reliable enough to perform the long-duration hovering tasks: search and rescue, offshore platform supply, crane work. That are the helicopter's defining applications. A rescue helicopter hovering over a vessel in distress for 45 minutes while its crew works the winch requires an engine that can sustain that power output continuously in whatever conditions exist without overheating or losing performance. The turboshaft does this. The engine hums in the helicopter above the rotor gearbox. The rotor turns at its governed RPM. The helicopter holds its position, not loudly, not heroically, not with any obvious effort, just steadily. The turbine spinning at tens of thousands of RPM, the shaft turning the gearbox turning the rotor holding the aircraft still above the world, the engine doing what it was designed to do, without stopping, for as long as it is asked. When a helicopter descends toward the ground, something changes in the way it flies, not dramatically. There is no jolt or sudden shift. It is more subtle than that. A slight increase in buoyancy, a gentle easing of the power required to maintain the hover, the aircraft becoming marginally more responsive to the collective as the ground approaches. Pilots who are paying attention notice it at roughly 1 rotor diameter above the surface, at about 15 meters for a medium helicopter, closer in for a small one, further out for a large one. Below this height, the physics of what the rotor is doing to the air change in a way that works in the aircraft's favor. This is ground effect. In free air, away from any surface, the rotor disc generates lift by accelerating air downward through the disc and producing the equal and opposite upward reaction. The air accelerated downward continues downward. It spreads and disperses, and the rotor is continuously working against gravity to accelerate fresh, undisturbed air. The process is thermodynamically expensive. The engine works hard, the fuel burns. Near the ground, the downward flowing air hits the surface and cannot continue downward. It spreads horizontally instead, building up a region of higher pressure air between the rotor and the surface, an air cushion that the rotor is now effectively pressing against, and that presses back. The rotor is no longer working entirely against gravity and against the dispersal of its own downwash. Part of the upward force is provided by the compressed cushion of air below. The same lift is achieved with less engine power, or equivalently, more lift is available for the same power. And this reduction in power required in ground effect can be 10 to 20% compared to hovering in free air at the same collective setting. For a helicopter operating at its maximum payload, already demanding every kilowatt of power the engine can produce to maintain a free air hover, ground effect can make the difference between being able to lift off and not being able to. Mountain rescue operators and offshore oil platform pilots know exactly at what height their specific aircraft transitions from out-of-ground effect to in-ground effect, because at maximum weight in those conditions, the transition matters operationally. The reverse is also true and equally important. The transition from ground effect to free air requires more power, so a helicopter that can hover comfortably a meter above a pad may find itself unable to maintain the hover when it climbs to 5 meters. The ground effect has been left behind, and the full free air power requirement is now in play. Pilots departing from confined areas at high altitude or high temperature, or with heavy loads, climb out quickly to escape the ground effect band, while simultaneously staying in it long enough to build the translational lift of forward flight, which provides a different aerodynamic advantage. The relationship between the helicopter and the ground below it is never simple indifference. When the aircraft is close enough, the ground gives something back, a cushion of compressed air, built from the rotor's own downwash, returned by the surface, silently reducing the cost of every departure, every approach, every hover close enough to the ground to receive it. The Chinook is audible before it is visible. The sound arrives first, a deep, rhythmic, overlapping thump that is unlike any other helicopter sound, the two rotors' blade passages interweaving at slightly different phases to produce a distinctive double beat. Then the aircraft appears, low and fast for its size, the two enormous rotors, one forward, one aft, turning in opposite directions on their respective pylons, the fuselage hanging between them, longer than a city bus and nearly as wide. The Boeing CH-47. Chinook first flew in 1961 and entered military service in 1962. Over 60 years later, it remains in production and in service with armed forces on multiple continents. The basic design continuously updated and refined, but structurally recognizable as the same aircraft. Its longevity reflects both the difficulty of the requirements it meets and the adequacy with which it meets them. A medium to heavy lift helicopter capable of operating in terrain and conditions that would challenge smaller aircraft, carrying payloads of up to 13,000 kilograms internally, or as an underslung external load, in all weather and at altitudes that defeat many comparable aircraft. The Chinook's tandem rotor configuration is one of the three main alternatives to the single main rotor design that Sikorsky pioneered. In the tandem design, two large rotors are mounted fore and aft along the length of the fuselage, each turning in the opposite direction to the other. The torque of the forward rotor is equal and opposite to the torque of the aft rotor, and they cancel each other out. No tail rotor is required, and all the engine power that would otherwise drive an anti-torque tail rotor is available for the main rotors. This gives the tandem helicopter a payload advantage over a comparable single rotor design. The tandem configuration also distributes the lift generation along a longer fuselage, which allows a larger and heavier aircraft to be built without the rotor diameter of a single rotor equivalent becoming impractically large. The Chinook's rotors, at 18.5 meters in diameter, are large but manageable. A single rotor helicopter carrying the same payload would require a rotor significantly larger, and consequently more complex and demanding to design and build. The coaxial configuration, 2 rotors mounted on the same shaft, one above the other, spinning in opposite directions, is the other main torque-cancelling design. The Russian Kamov series of helicopters uses this arrangement, and more recently, the Sikorsky X-2 and the Sikorsky-Boeing SB-1 Defiant have explored the coaxial design's potential for high-speed flight. The coaxial helicopter is more compact than a tandem or single-rotor aircraft for a given rotor diameter because there is no tail boom. The tail rotor's function is served by the counter-rotating second rotor, and the machine is symmetrical, which confers certain handling quality advantages. Beyond the main rotor configurations, some helicopters use a fenestron, a shrouded fan built into the tail fin, enclosed in a duct that protects the blades and substantially reduces the noise signature compared to a conventional tail rotor. Others use the NOTAR, no tail rotor, system developed originally by Hughes helicopters, which uses pressurized air blown through slots along the tail boom to create an aerodynamic force through the Coanda effect that replaces the mechanical tail rotor entirely. Each solution to the torque problem represents a different set of engineering compromises. The Chinook, with its tandem rotors and its characteristic double beat sound, represents the solution that best suits certain tasks. The tasks at the heavy end, the tasks in mountains, the tasks that require carrying things too large or too heavy for any other helicopter to manage. It has been doing those tasks for over 60 years. Still in production, still the same fundamental idea. 2 rotors, opposite directions, every torque cancelled by its equal. Air at altitude weighs less than air at sea level. This is not a metaphor. At higher altitudes, the atmospheric pressure is lower, the air molecules are more dispersed, and a given volume of air contains fewer molecules and therefore has lower mass. A rotor blade moving through this air generates less lift per revolution than the same blade moving at the same speed through denser air at sea level. There is simply less air to push downward. The engine, meanwhile, is also working with thinner air in its intake and produces less power than it would at sea level. The combination of reduced rotor efficiency and reduced engine power is described by the concept of density altitude, a calculated value that expresses the performance of an aircraft in terms of the equivalent sea level altitude at which the air would have the same density. If the air at 5,000 feet is very hot and humid, the density altitude might be 8,000 feet. The aircraft is performing as if it were at 8,000 feet, even though it is physically at 5,000. Density altitude can be higher than actual altitude when the temperature is high. It can be lower in cold conditions. Mountain helicopter pilots calculate density altitude before every flight. The calculation involves the actual altitude, the outside air temperature, and the local atmospheric pressure. The resulting number is checked against the aircraft's performance charts. The manufacturer published data that specifies what the helicopter can and cannot do at any given density. Altitude, weight, and power setting. And the charts have lines labelled hover in ground effect and hover out of ground effect and maximum continuous power. And the pilot's job before the flight is to confirm that the planned operation falls within the safe operating envelope of the aircraft in the actual conditions. Departing from a high mountain landing zone at maximum weight in summer on a warm afternoon, pushes the calculation hard. The power available may only marginally exceed the power required. The margin between what the aircraft can do and what will cause it to settle back to the ground, or worse, to commit to a departure corridor and then be unable to climb, is narrower at altitude than anywhere else in aviation. Mountain pilots develop a conservative habit of mind. Better to offload a bag, better to leave fuel behind, and better to wait for the temperature to drop in the evening than to attempt a departure on a too thin margin. Mountain flying also requires specific techniques for terrain that slopes. A helicopter landing on a slope must be managed carefully. The rotor disc that is nearly horizontal in level flight becomes, on a slope, tilted relative to the terrain, and the upslope rotor tip is closer to the ground than the downslope tip. A steep enough slope can bring a rotor blade into contact with the terrain on the upslope side during the landing, which is not recoverable. Mountain pilots approach slopes toe-on, landing the forward skid tips first, and then settling the aircraft back while the pilot monitors the clearance on both sides. And they know from their aircraft's handbook exactly what slope angle their specific type can safely operate on. The mountain is not hostile to the helicopter. It simply requires that the helicopter and the person flying it know exactly what they are capable of, and stay honestly within that knowledge. The calculation before the flight, the margin maintained during it, the landing confirmed safe before the commitment is made, and then the landing, the only aircraft that could be here, doing this, in this thin air, on this slope, in these mountains. A cockpit at night is a particular kind of darkness, not the darkness of a room or of outdoor night, both of which the eye adjusts to and finds navigable. The darkness of a night cockpit is managed darkness, the instruments providing exactly enough light to be read, tuned to their night brightness setting to preserve the pilot's dark adaptation, and the glow of the displays the only illumination in the forward field of view. Outside the cockpit windows, the world ranges from the absolute black of overcast ocean or featureless terrain to the familiar orange grid of a city below. The navigation lights of other aircraft, the occasional sweep of a lighthouse, or the winking obstruction lights of tall structures. Flying a helicopter at night without visual reference to the horizon requires the pilot to trust the instruments completely. The natural human sense of balance and orientation, the vestibular system, is not reliable in flight. The semicircular canals of the inner ear, which detect rotational accelerations, are deceived by sustained turns and by the gradual onset of unusual attitudes. A pilot who relies on their bodily sense of level, rather than the artificial horizon instrument, will eventually fly the aircraft into the ground or into the sea, believing themselves to be in straight and level flight. This is called spatial disorientation, and it is the cause of a significant proportion of fatal accidents in both fixed-wing and rotary aviation. The instrument scan, the systematic, regular sweep across the flight instruments that the pilot maintains throughout instrument flight, keeps the aircraft under control by providing the actual, reliable information that the body's own sensors cannot give. Altitude, airspeed, heading, vertical speed, attitude, each instrument consulted in sequence. The cross-check confirming the aircraft is where it should be, and doing what it should be doing, since the scan cycling before any parameter has time to depart significantly from its intended value. Night vision goggles, NVGs, transform night operations for the pilots who use them. Military helicopter crews and many emergency service operators fly routinely with NVGs, the devices amplifying the available light to produce a vivid, green-tinted image of the world that reveals detail invisible to the naked eye. Flying at low level at night with NVGs, the terrain appears as a detailed landscape rather than an undifferentiated darkness. The risk of encountering unseen obstacles is dramatically reduced. Operations that would be impossible under naked eye night conditions become routine. The goggles introduce their own limitations. The field of view is narrower than natural vision, depth perception is reduced, and the color information that the human eye uses for many discrimination tasks is lost in the monochromatic green image, and the cockpit instrumentation must be adapted. Conventional cockpit lighting, which includes wavelengths that the NVG amplifier responds to dramatically, must be replaced with NVG-compatible lighting that the goggles do not amplify, and that the eyes behind the goggles can still read. The night world seen through NVGs from a helicopter at 200 feet is something that most people will never see, because the specific combination of equipment and access required to see it is not commonly available. The terrain below in cold green detail, the roads as slightly lighter ribbons through the darker ground cover, the watercourses as reflective lines, and the lights of isolated buildings bright enough in the amplified image to require care to look directly at. The helicopter in the dark, the instruments glowing, the world outside rendered in green, the pilot scanning, the aircraft going where it is directed, through a night that the equipment has made navigable, and that nothing else in the air could navigate this way. The call comes in the middle of the night. A vessel in difficulty, 120 kilometers offshore, in sea state 5, wave heights of 3 to 4 meters, the sea surface confused and breaking, the wind 30 to 40 knots from the southwest. The vessel is taking on water. The crew needs to be lifted off. Surface vessels in the area are making for the position, but are hours away, and the situation is deteriorating. The helicopter crew, 2 pilots, a winchman, possibly a rescue swimmer, are at readiness. They brief the weather, the position, the fuel required, the sea state, the likely approach geometry. The aircraft is pre-flighted, the winch is checked, the medical equipment is loaded, the crew boards, the engines start, the rotor RPM climbs to its governed value. The aircraft lifts off. Nothing else in the fleet can do what this aircraft is about to do. A fixed-wing aircraft could reach the position faster. It cannot hover. It cannot lower a winchman to a vessel in a sea state 5. A surface vessel can pick up survivors, but it is hours away, and in these conditions, it would be operating at the limit of its own safety margins. The helicopter is the tool for this task, in these conditions now. The approach to a vessel in distress involves the pilot flying a precise hover above the target, typically the stern or the most sheltered deck of the vessel, while compensating for the relative motion between the hovering aircraft and the moving ship below. In calm conditions, this is demanding. In sea state 5, with the vessel rolling and pitching, it is among the most technically demanding flying that any helicopter pilot performs. The aircraft cannot simply hold a fixed position in the air. It must track the motion of the vessel below, rising as the ship rises and descending as it falls, maintaining the cable length at a safe working tension, while the winchman at the end of the cable manages the physical transfer of survivors. The winchman is the person at the end of the wire, who's descending from a hovering helicopter onto the deck of a pitching vessel, in the dark, in 30-knot wind, the sea surface visible meters below, and the helicopter above invisible beyond the deck edge. This is a specific combination of physical and psychological demands that winchman training addresses over hundreds of hours of practice before the operational qualification is awarded. Igor Sikorsky considered the search and rescue role the most important application of his invention. He wrote about it and spoke about it through the years of his active career. The first naval helicopter rescue using a Sikorsky aircraft was performed in 1947 by one of his company's own test pilots, Jimmy Viner. From that beginning, the helicopter's rescue capability expanded to mountain rescue, to medical evacuation, to disaster response, so to the routine but never ordinary work of the Coast Guard helicopter services that operate over the seas and coasts of every maritime nation. The helicopter at 120 kilometers offshore, the vessel below, the winchman on the wire, the sea in the dark, the thing that Sikorsky built for, being used for what it was built for. The sound of a helicopter is the sound of a physical problem being managed. Every component of the acoustic signature of a helicopter in flight represents a specific aerodynamic or mechanical event happening at a specific frequency. The main rotor produces a blade passage frequency, the rate at which the blades pass a fixed point, determined by the number of blades, and the rotor, RPM, saw a 4-blade rotor at 300 revolutions per minute produces a blade passage frequency of 20 Hz, 20 pulses per second, which falls in the lower end of the audible range and is perceived as a deep thrum. The tail rotor, spinning at 5 to 6 times the main rotor speed, and typically with 2 to 4 blades, produces its own higher frequency blade passage tone. These tones are present in all flight conditions. The additional sound that gives helicopters their distinctive character in certain maneuvers, the sharp, rhythmic thwop 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 that carries for kilometers on a still morning, is produced by blade vortex interaction. Every rotor blade, as it passes through the air, leaves behind a rotating vortex at its tip, a small tornado of disturbed air that trails behind the blade and slowly dissipates. In straight and level flight, at the blade vortices are generally swept aft and below the rotor disc, and the following blades do not encounter them. But in a descending, decelerating approach, the flight condition in which a helicopter is reducing speed and altitude simultaneously, the rotor disc descends into its own previously generated vortex trail, and the following blades slice through the tip vortices left by the blades just ahead. When a blade tip encounters a vortex, the local aerodynamic loading on that section of the blade changes abruptly. A sharp pressure pulse is generated, and this pulse propagates outward as a sound wave of significantly higher amplitude than the steady blade passage tone. This is the characteristic helicopter descent noise, sometimes called blade slap, and it is directional. It is loudest to observers beneath the descent path and forward of the aircraft. Helicopter pilots are typically trained to avoid steep, slow descents over populated areas, partly for this reason. The noise problem has driven substantial engineering investment in quieter rotor systems. Blade tip shape is one lever. The square blade tips of early helicopters have been replaced on modern designs with swept, tapered tips that spread the vortex generation over a larger span and reduce the intensity of the tip vortex that the following blade encounters. The fenestron, the shrouded tail fan, substantially reduces the tail rotor's noise contribution by enclosing the blades in a duct that breaks up the tip vortex generation. The notar system eliminates the tail rotor and its noise entirely, and the military interest in quiet helicopters is obvious. But the civil helicopter industry also faces increasing pressure to reduce the noise impact of helicopter operations over urban areas, where hospital helipads, police helicopters, and air ambulances must operate in close proximity to dense populations. The acoustic engineering of rotor blade design has become a significant discipline within helicopter development. The designers balancing the aerodynamic requirements of lift and efficiency against the acoustic requirements of reduced tip vortex intensity and blade vortex interaction. The sound of a helicopter, not a problem to be accepted, a problem to be understood, and one blade design at a time made quieter. In forward flight, the helicopter's rotor faces an aerodynamic problem that does not exist in the hover. In a hover, all the rotor blades are moving through the air at the same speed, the rotational tip speed, approximately 215 meters per second. Every blade at every position on the disc is meeting the air at the same relative velocity, generating the same amount of lift per unit of span. The disc is aerodynamically symmetrical. The lift is even. In forward flight, this symmetry is broken. The rotor disc is tilted slightly forward to direct a component of the lift force horizontally, propelling the aircraft. But as the aircraft moves forward, the blade that is advancing, moving forward into the oncoming airflow, is moving faster relative to the air than the blade that is retreating, moving aft with the oncoming airflow. The advancing blade's velocity is the rotational tip speed plus the aircraft's forward speed. The retreating blade's velocity is the rotational tip speed minus the aircraft's forward speed. At 100 knots of forward speed, the difference between the advancing and retreating blade tip velocities is 200 knots, a significant fraction of the total tip speed. The advancing blade is generating substantially more lift than the retreating blade, because lift is proportional to the square of the airspeed. If nothing is done to compensate, the rotor would produce far more lift on the advancing side than the retreating side. The disc would roll violently toward the retreating side, and the aircraft would be uncontrollable. The solution was found before the first practical helicopters flew, in the articulated rotor hub. An articulated rotor allows each blade to flap, to move up and down about a horizontal hinge at the blade root. The advancing blade, generating excess lift, flaps upward. As it flaps up, the angle at which it meets the airflow changes. The relative wind is now coming from slightly below rather than from directly ahead, and this reduces the blade's effective angle of attack and consequently its lift. The retreating blade flaps down, its effective angle of attack increases, and its lift increases. The flapping motion automatically equalizes the lift across the disc without any direct pilot input. This automatic equalization through blade flapping is one of the most elegant mechanical solutions in aviation. The aerodynamic imbalance of forward flight corrected by the mechanical response of the blade itself, and the geometry of the articulated hub, converting an excess of lift into a flapping motion and a deficit into its opposite, continuously at every rotor azimuth throughout the flight. there is a limit to this self-correction. As forward speed increases, the retreating blade's velocity relative to the air decreases further. At very high forward speeds, the retreating blade tip may be nearly stationary relative to the surrounding air and producing almost no lift even after the flapping compensation. This retreating blade stall limits the maximum forward speed of conventional helicopters to approximately 160 to 200 knots, depending on the design. Beyond this speed, no amount of collective pitch increase can produce useful lift from the retreating blade, and the disc becomes aerodynamically unbalanced beyond recovery. It is the speed limit that physics writes on the helicopter, not an arbitrary design choice, not an engineering failure, just the point where the retreating blade, slowing in the airflow, can no longer keep up with the advancing blade, gaining. The rotor reaches its boundary. The pilot, knowing this, stays within it. The aircraft flies on. The helicopter is at work before dawn on a mountainside in British Columbia. The logging crew has been on the ridge since first light. The trees they have felled are cut and bucked into lengths, stacked at the designated pickup point, each log weighing between half a ton and 2 tons, depending on the species and the diameter. The pickup point is unreachable by any ground vehicle. The slope is too steep, the terrain too broken, the forest too dense. The logs will come out by helicopter, one at a time, slung beneath the aircraft on a long line, carried from the ridge to the log deck at the valley floor where the trucks wait. This is long line external load work, one of the demanding specialties of commercial helicopter operation, and it is work that exists as a viable industry only because the helicopter exists. Before the helicopter, getting timber out of terrain like this required either roads, blasted and bulldozed into steep slopes at enormous cost and environmental impact, or leaving the timber in place. The helicopter changed the economics of the calculation. A skilled longline pilot working efficiently can carry 20 to 30 loads per hour on a short cycle, each load representing a log that would otherwise require a road to reach. On the helicopter, working in this environment is typically a medium turbine machine, a Bell 212 or a Sikorsky S61, or for the heaviest loads, a Sikorsky S64 sky crane, a helicopter designed entirely around its lifting function, the fuselage reduced to a structural framework supporting the rotor system with no enclosed cabin below the rotor head. The pilot sitting in a glazed cab at the front with an unobstructed view downward to the load below. The longline pilot works from a hover, positioned above the load, the long line hanging below the aircraft with a hook at its end. The ground crew attaches the choker, the cable or strap already around the log, to the hook. The pilot, monitoring the load weight on the cargo hook scale, applies collective and lifts. The log comes clear of the ground and hangs vertical in the air below the aircraft. The aircraft trimmed to account for the pendulum effect of the swinging load. The pilot flies the load to the landing zone, releases it on the signal from the ground crew below, and returns for the next one. The external load slung beneath a helicopter has its own aerodynamics and its own handling challenges. A dense cylindrical load, a concrete pile, a log, a steel beam, handles differently from a flat panel or a net of loose material. The load can oscillate under the aircraft, swinging in a circle or in a pendulum motion that affects the aircraft's handling and must be managed or stopped before the load is set down. Experienced longline pilots develop an intuitive feel for the aerodynamic characteristics of different load types and shapes. Offshore, the same technique supplies oil platforms with equipment and materials that the supply vessel cannot deliver in bad weather. Cases of critical spares, lengths of pipe, personnel transfers in conditions where the vessel cannot safely come alongside. The helicopter as a crane, working in 3 dimensions, able to access any deck of any platform and place a load with a precision measured in centimeters. Power line inspection, film production, aerial survey, cattle mustering in the Australian outback, where the helicopter is the boundary rider that works 10,000 acres before breakfast. A machine that can go anywhere and carry anything it can lift to anywhere it can reach. The approach to land is the reverse of the departure. The same physical processes running backwards, at the same controls, managing the same forces, but in the opposite direction. The pilot reduces the collective slightly, the reduced lift allowing the aircraft to begin descending. The cyclic is adjusted to control the approach angle and the forward speed, typically a gentle descent at around 60 to 70 knots for a normal approach. The aircraft tracking a path toward the landing zone that the pilot has selected and assessed before the approach began. The aircraft is a winged machine in forward flight during this phase. Translational lift supplementing the rotor's hovering efficiency with the additional lift that comes from the forward airspeed flowing over the rotor disc. At some point in the final approach, at 50 to 200 feet, depending on the speed at which the approach is being flown, the pilot performs the flare. The cyclic comes back, the nose rises, the rotor disc tilts aft, its thrust vector swinging backward and upward simultaneously. The aft tilt decelerates the aircraft. The horizontal component of the thrust vector is now directed against the direction of flight. The upward swing increases the angle of attack on all blades and generates a burst of additional lift that reduces the descent rate. The airspeed that the aircraft had at the beginning of the flare is being converted into rotor, RPM, and upward force. The flare trading airspeed for lift is a precise art. The timing, when to begin, how aggressively to execute, when to level the aircraft out before touchdown, varies with the wind conditions, the approach speed, the weight of the aircraft, the power available, and the surface being landed on. A helipad on a rooftop requires a different approach geometry than an open field. A confined landing zone in a forest clearing requires a steeper, slower approach that sacrifices the aerodynamic advantages of a faster run-on landing. Each landing zone has its own requirements, and each pilot builds the specific approach technique for each situation they encounter. The final hover above the landing zone, the brief, low hover before the aircraft is settled to the surface, is the one moment where the pilot can pause and confirm that the zone is acceptable before committing to the landing. The surface is checked for slope, for softness, for obstacles. If anything is wrong, the pilot has the power and the altitude to abort and go around. This is the protocol for precision landings. Assess from the hover, confirm, commit. The collective comes down gently. The aircraft settles. The skids or wheels make contact with the surface. The aircraft's weight transferring progressively from the rotor to the landing gear as the collective is lowered through the point at which the rotor produces just enough lift to support the aircraft, and then below it. The aircraft is on the ground. The rotor is still spinning. The engine is still running. the aircraft is still technically airworthy. It can lift off again in seconds if the situation demands it. A helicopter on the ground is not committed to the ground the way a fixed-wing aircraft is after landing. It is a machine that has paused briefly at the surface but remains ready. The pilot holds the collective down. The aircraft rests. The rotor turns above, and the particular piece of a helicopter after landing. The machine stilled on its own terms, in its own place. The engine still warm, the blades still making their low, slow sound through the cooling air, settles over the scene. The approach complete. The landing made. The machine at rest for now, in a place only it could reach. The engine shuts down and the sound of the helicopter changes. Not immediately. The rotor system has too much inertia to respond instantly to the loss of driving power. The blades continue to turn under their own momentum, the rotational energy stored in their mass, and speed persisting for many seconds after the fuel stops burning and the turbine stops spinning. The sound changes character rather than stopping. The high turbine whine fades quickly, but the rhythmic blade passage, the sound of the rotor itself, the air being disturbed by the spinning blades, continues, decelerating gradually through its frequencies. You can hear it slow. At normal operating RPM, the blade passage frequency is above the range where individual strokes are distinguishable. It is a continuous sound, a hum with a tone. As the rotor decelerates after shutdown, the frequency drops. Somewhere around a third of normal RPM, the individual blade passages begin to be separately audible, a rhythmic pulse rather than a continuous hum. Each blade's pass through the air, arriving as a distinct beat. Lower still, the beats slow to the pace of a walking person. Lower still, and there are long seconds between each blade's passage overhead, the blades barely moving, each one audible as an individual event rather than a contribution to a combined sound. Then, the last blade, at the last fraction of a turn, comes to rest, and the helipad is quiet. You have spent tonight inside this machine. You know now that the drooping blades at rest will become, in 60 seconds of rotor spool-up, invisible, moving so fast that the disc appears transparent, the blade tips travelling at 700 feet per second, 60% of the speed of sound. You know that both hands and both feet are active at all times in a demanding hover, each correction triggering the next, the body learning to make these corrections faster than thought. You know that if the engine stops, the pilot immediately lowers the collective, and the aircraft becomes a sycamore seed, its altitude converting to the rotor energy that will carry it safely to the ground. That Jean Boulet flew this descent from 40,814 feet after his engine flamed out in minus 63 degrees Celsius and landed safely. You know that the tail rotor is solving Newton's third law every second of every flight, that the articulated rotor hub corrects the dissymmetry of lift in forward flight automatically. That ground effect gives the aircraft a cushion of compressed air built from its own downwash, that the turboshaft engine of 1951 made everything practical by delivering extraordinary power in very little weight. You know that Igor Sikorsky first flew for 10 seconds, 3 feet off the ground, tethered on September 14th, 1939, in a suit and a fedora, that he tried 19 different configurations before settling on the design that 80 years later remains the configuration of most of the helicopters in the world. That when he was asked what he was most proud of, he said, "The rescues. The last blade has stopped. The helipad is dark and quiet. The machine rests in the last of the evening's warmth. Before you close your eyes tonight, one small thing that matters greatly to this channel. Please hit the like button and subscribe if you haven't yet, because tomorrow night we will be here again with another story built for exactly this hour. Your place is kept. But for now, the engine is cooling, the blades are drooping again, returning to their resting geometry, gravity reclaiming them from the centrifugal tension of flight. The helipad is still, and the machine that was at the bottom of the sea this morning is at rest on its pad now, the work done. Still, quiet, the blades at rest. Sleep well,